everyone, I hope everyone's having a great day today. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the role of nutrition in cancer prevention. In last week's video, we discussed the relationship between cancer and overweight and obesity. I do want to start off with an important note that this video is not intended to be some sort of fear-mongering campaign on food. We're all allowed to enjoy food. That's normal, it's healthy, it's human. However, we also need to be aware of the risk factors associated with consuming certain types of food, especially if we're going to be consuming those things on a regular basis. It's what we do in our day-to-day lives that holds the most weight versus what we do on a particular holiday or a birthday or a vacation or something like that. So I think it's really important to look at not just the meal choices we make on a daily basis, but the little bite of this that we have on a daily basis, and the little bite of that, and the sip of this, and the sip of that. Because when we take like those little bites or those little sips or those, little things that we do here and there, we oftentimes kind of reinforce this idea to ourselves that they're not that big, they don't add up, but oftentimes those things are adding up to quite a lot more over time than we realize. And that's kind of the insidious nature of that impact. So in today's homework, we're going to be discussing 3 food categories and their relationship with cancer and cancer risk. So I'm going to be looking down from time to time because we do have some different numbers here, and I want to be sure to keep those straight. But first, we're going to be discussing processed foods. We're going to be discussing alcohol, and we are going to be discussing processed and red meat, which I'm going to kind of keep in a category separate from processed foods as a whole. So processed foods, what are we talking about when we're talking about a processed food? I think it's helpful to first talk about what we're not talking about when we're talking about a processed food. When we look at the average American's diet, more than 70% of the calories we consume, just for that, again, the average American, come from processed or ultra-processed foods. And that's a problem, frankly, not just for cancer, but disease as a whole. And remembering that overweight and obesity in and of themselves are chronic diseases. But even in the absence of overweight and obesity, these, the regular consumption of processed and ultra-processed foods can cause other diseases that are just as impactful, if not more. And so when we look at unprocessed foods, what are we talking about? It's relatively few things. When we talk about unprocessed foods, we're talking about things like fruit and vegetables in their whole form. So if we look at an orange, or actually I'm going to use an apple. We're going to use an apple because that's a little bit easier. We can use this in multiple ways. So an apple is an unprocessed food. Apple juice is a processed food. If we take it one step further and we take that apple juice and now we make it into fruit snacks, this is an ultra processed food. So kind of the further you get away from nature, the more processed something is going to become. We're going to use soybeans as an example. If we're looking at something like edamame in pod, this is an unprocessed food. We can then process it into tofu. Tofu is still a very healthy food. It is processed to a higher degree, but for the most part, we would still consider it minimally processed at most. Now, if we take that and we turn it into protein powder or a protein shake or a protein bar or a veggie burger, this is now an ultra processed food. Again, the further we get from nature, the more ingredients we're adding, the more preservatives we're adding, the more and more processed this food is becoming. And that's problematic. Not only do those things tend to be lower in nutrition content, they also tend to be higher in ingredients like salt, ingredients like sugar, in unhealthy fats, lots of binders and things that we know to be pro-inflammatory. And so if we're just to talk about kind of what a processed or ultra-processed diet would look like on a daily basis, it does look like a diet that many Americans are consuming and might, just on the surface, consider to be not terribly unhealthy. So let's talk about what a diet comprised of processed and ultra-processed foods would look like, because a lot of people are going to be thinking to themselves, well, I'm not going through the drive-through for every meal, so I'm not eating a processed or ultra-processed diet, but let's go through. Okay, so they get up and they have a banana over the top of some Honey Nut Cheerios with some milk. Well, Honey Nut Cheerios are an ultra-processed food. The banana is unprocessed. The milk is what we would consider to be a minimally processed ingredient. So still processed, not quite as much. If it was chocolate milk or strawberry milk, definitely an ultra processed food. Moving on, they go to work and there are some Hershey's Kisses on their desk. They eat 2 of those. That's an ultra processed food. We move on to lunch and they have a sandwich, and it's a sandwich on whole wheat bread with turkey and a little bit of salami, and they have some crackers on the side. Well, the salami is definitely an ultra processed food. The bread is an ultra processed food. The crackers were an ultra processed food. Depending on the turkey they were using, it's at least a processed food, if not an ultra processed food. And that's just through lunchtime. I'm not going to go down the road of dinner and anything that might come after or in the afternoon. And again, that's not to criticize anyone's diet. It's just to show that these things are so prevalent that we just don't even really recognize anymore how processed many of our diets have become. And those foods in and of themselves are pro-inflammatory and are associated with a pretty dramatic increase in cancer risk. For every 10% of someone's diet that is comprised of ultra-processed foods, their risk for cancer goes up by about 23%. Some cancers more than others, but it is a sizable risk factor. And so if we look at the fact that more than 70% of the average American's diet is comprised of processed and ultra-processed foods, it should not be terribly surprising the increased rates of cancer, especially nutritionally impacted cancers, things like colon cancer, breast cancer, so on and so forth. It's not surprising that the rates of these cancers have exploded over the last couple of decades. Moving on from processed and ultra-processed foods, we're going to talk about alcohol. I think a lot of people have a really misinformed view of alcohol. There were a lot of studies done on associations between wine consumption in particular and cardiovascular disease. And I think as a result of some of those studies and some kind of the discussion that was had around those things and the attention that was paid to those studies, I think a lot of people have kind of developed a health halo around drinking behaviors. Again, particularly with wine, but I think with alcohol in general. And kind of the human nature is such that we want to believe what we want to believe. It's very difficult to convince people otherwise, even as large research bodies like the American Heart Association or the International Agency on Cancer Research have repeatedly come out and said there is no safe level of alcohol. People still kind of want to go, but what about heart health? It's like, okay, but what about cancer risk? Let's redirect our attention to, and with regards to heart health, as we're on the topic, we do see that in some instances there are associations, but there's not a direct link. And so I think it's really important to set that aside and just look at the hard facts that alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen. There is a direct link to cancer and it is sizable. In at least the UK, we don't have quite quantifiable data here in the US, but in the UK, about half of all cancers attributed to alcohol are not attributed to overconsumption of alcohol or what we would consider to be overconsumption. Instead, half of all of the cancers caused by alcohol in the UK are actually caused by what we would consider to be light drinking, or 1 drink a day or less. When we see somebody who's consuming about 1 drink a day, they have about a 17% increase in their cancer risk. And that is because alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen and it does cause changes on a genetic level. Moving on to processed meat and red meat. When we talk about processed meat, we are talking about things like turkey bacon. We're talking about things, bacon as a whole, regardless of what it comes from. We're talking about things like jerky. We're talking about smoked meats. We're talking about cured meats, but we're also talking about meats that might be labeled uncured. So things like an uncured salami or an uncured pepperoni. They actually are cured just by a process, and that allows them to sort of skirt the labeling regulations on that. So jerky, bacon, salami, pepperoni, veggie burgers, any sort of meat that is really quite far from how it was kind of originally butchered, frankly. So if we take a chicken breast, for example, a chicken breast would be considered a unprocessed or minimally processed item. Okay, but now we slice it really thin and we smoke it and we serve it as just sort of like a processed deli meat. This is now definitely a processed food. We take it a step further and we turn it into chicken bacon or chicken sausage. This is now an ultra processed food. And when we look at those processed and ultra processed meats, these are also considered to be group 1 carcinogens, just like alcohol or just like tobacco, for example, is also a group 1 carcinogen. So for every 2 ounces of processed meat consumed each week, there is an 18% increase in cancer risk, and this is especially prevalent for GI cancers as well as colon and rectal cancers. With red meat, this is things like pork, this is things like beef, this is things like game meats. For every 4 ounces consumed per week, there is a 17% increase in cancer risk. So a little bit lower with red meat, but they are still considered carcinogenic. They are group 2A, which means basically just the risk is a little bit lower, but still it's less direct, but there is still a sizable increase in risk. Whereas with those kind of group 1 carcinogens, things like the alcohol, the processed meats, it is a direct and clear relationship. So when we're looking at our consumption of things like processed meats, red meats, alcohol, ultra processed foods, again, the goal isn't to say someone should never consume these things. The goal is to have somebody be able to stand back and understand their relative risk and understand how worth it those choices really are for them. For some people, they're going to feel like, yes, that choice is absolutely worth it for me. For other people, they're really going to be looking at it and going, man, I've seen my life impacted by cancer, or I've seen this other person's life impacted by cancer, or maybe I've just not even been around it, but I know I don't want it, relative to the amount of enjoyment they get from having that product on a regular basis. For most of us, we want to live long lives, we want to live healthy lives, we want to live lives free of disease, and I think it's really important to not take like a fear-mongering approach with food, but really understand that what we expose ourselves to in however much, whether it's a little bit here and a little bit there in a way that adds up, or really truly intentional choices, understanding that all of those things do bear weight, no pun intended, and the choices that we make collectively are ultimately what inform our risk for any particular disease, cancer included. I hope that something from this video stood out to you guys. Go ahead and answer the prompt above for today's homework, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.